"Mom, we already left for the airport. Didn't want to wake you." That was the voicemail my son Daniel left me at 5 in the morning on Thanksgiving Day. I stood alone in my own kitchen, in the house I had paid for, listening to the silence of 5 empty chairs. The words hit me harder than the cold coming through the window I'd left, cracked open the night before. $62,000 in private school tuition, 3 years of groceries, a car I'd bought outright, and not even a goodbye. I didn't cry. I picked up the phone and called the movers. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and I am 68 years old. I want to tell you what happened in the 5 days that followed, because by the time my son and his family landed back in Ohio from Dubai, everything about their lives, and mine, had changed. But before I tell you about the phone that rang 25 times while I sat calmly in a lawyer's office, I need to tell you who I was before that Thanksgiving morning and what I had built with my own 2 hands. I was born in a small town outside Dayton, the daughter of a machinist and a seamstress, and I learned early that nothing in this life comes to you simply because you deserve it. You work for it, you save for it, and you protect it fiercely once you have it. My mother used to say that a woman's signature on a piece of paper was the only inheritance she could truly guarantee her daughters, because everything else, houses, husbands, even children, could be taken from you by circumstance, but no one could take away the fact that you had learned to read a contract before you signed it. I did not fully understand what she meant until I was much older, sitting across from men twice my age at the hardware store where I first learned bookkeeping, watching how easily people signed things they hadn't read simply because someone they trusted had told them to. I married my husband Robert when I was 23. He drove trucks for a produce distributor, long hauls that kept him gone 4, sometimes 5 days a week. And I raised our son Daniel largely on my own, working as a bookkeeper for a hardware store during the day and taking in ledgers for 2 other small businesses at night. I remember those years as exhausting and, in their own way, deeply satisfying. I was building something with numbers, learning to see patterns in other people's businesses that told me exactly where trouble was quietly forming, months before the owners themselves noticed it. That skill, that particular way of reading a ledger for the story hidden inside it rather than just the totals at the bottom, is the same skill that let me sit at my own kitchen table on Thanksgiving morning and understand, almost instantly, that what I was looking at was not one bad morning, but the visible tip of a pattern 3 years deep. When Robert died of a heart attack at 51, I had already spent a decade building something he never lived to see. My own small accounting practice, 3 employees, a modest office above a bakery on 4th Street. I sold that practice when I was 62, and it, along with Robert's small life insurance policy and 25 years of careful saving, is what let me buy the house on Maple Street outright. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a garden Robert had wanted and never got to plant. I paid cash. There has never been a mortgage on that house in my name, not for one single day. Daniel grew up watching me count every dollar twice, and I think some part of him decided early that money was simply a thing that appeared if you waited long enough, because someone else was always managing it for you. He was a sweet boy, sensitive, quick to cry when other children were unkind, and I loved him with the particular fierceness of a woman who had raised a child mostly alone. When he met Priya in his late 20s, I was thrilled. She was sharp, ambitious, worked in marketing for a mid-sized firm downtown, and for the first few years of their marriage, I believed, truly believed, that my son had found a partner who would build something solid with him. Then came the children, 3 of them, born within 5 years of each other. Sophia, then the twins, Marcus and Owen. And then came the trouble. Daniel's small logistics consulting business collapsed during a rough stretch when 2 of his biggest clients left within the same quarter. Priya's marketing job survived, but one income in that house, with 3 young children and a mortgage on a home they had bought too ambitiously in 2019, was not enough. They came to me in the spring of that year, sitting at my kitchen table, Daniel's hands shaking slightly around his coffee cup, and asked if they could move in with me, just for a little while, just until things stabilized. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Of course I did. I had 4 bedrooms and 1 aging woman rattling around in them. I told myself it would be good for all of us. The sound of children's feet on the stairs again, a full table at dinner, purpose in my days. I never once considered charging them rent. That would come to matter later, more than I could have imagined that spring afternoon. What followed were 3 years that I now understand, with painful clarity, were not a temporary arrangement at all, but a slow and comfortable absorption of everything I had. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way water wears down stone, patiently, invisibly, until one day you look up and the shape of everything has changed. It began with small things. I paid the property taxes, as I always had, because it was my house, and that seemed only fair. But then the utility bills started arriving in amounts that startled me. Heating bills nearly double what I'd paid living alone, water bills reflecting 3 children's worth of baths and laundry. I paid them without complaint, because family helps family. Then came the car. Priya's old sedan finally gave out in the second winter, and I wrote a check for $18,000 for a certified used minivan, because how else was she supposed to get 3 children to 3 different schools? Then came the tuition. Sophia, the eldest, was struggling in the overcrowded public elementary school nearby, and Daniel and Priya sat me down and explained, with real anguish in their voices, that the private academy across town had a wait list opening and it would change her life. $6,000 a year, per child, once all 3 were enrolled. Over 3 years, across all 3 children, that came to just over $62,000. I paid it in full, every semester, without ever asking to see a single report card. I filled their refrigerator every week. I bought school supplies, birthday gifts, soccer cleats, a new roof when the old one started leaking above the twins' bedroom, $11,000 for that alone. I did all of this gladly, because for 68 years, I have believed that the purpose of money is the people you love. And I had money, and I loved them. But somewhere in the second year, I began to notice something shift beneath the surface of our life together, something I couldn't name at first. It started with the holidays. The first Thanksgiving after they moved in, I hosted, as I always had. I cooked for 2 days. The second Thanksgiving, Priya suggested, gently, that perhaps hosting was too much for me now, and that they would take over the cooking. I agreed, grateful for the rest, and sat at my own table while my daughter-in-law directed the meal I had once run with total command. By the third Thanksgiving, the one I am telling you about now, I was not consulted about the meal at all. I was not consulted about anything. I began noticing the way conversations would stop when I entered a room. Not dramatically, just a small pause, a shift in tone, the way people speak differently when they think you can't quite follow anymore. I began noticing that decisions about the house, repainting a bedroom, replacing furniture in the living room, even rearranging the pantry, were made and executed without ever mentioning them to me first, even though every dollar spent on those changes had come, one way or another, from accounts I still quietly funded. I began noticing that Marcus, the sweeter of the twins, had started calling me the old lady to his friends on the phone, not unkindly, but the way you'd refer to furniture that had always been in the house. I noticed that when Priya's parents visited from Toronto twice a year, I was seated at the far end of the table, and the conversation in those visits revolved entirely around trips. A cruise, a ski trip to Colorado, a long weekend in New York, that I was never once invited to join, though I was somehow always the one whose careful budgeting had freed up the money that made those trips possible. There was the matter of my 66th birthday dinner 2 years before. Priya had promised a dinner out, somewhere nice, just the adults, and then 2 days beforehand had texted that the sitter had fallen through, and could we simply do cake at home instead? We did cake at home. I did not mind the cake. What I minded, quietly, was that 6 months earlier I had watched them hire a sitter without any difficulty at all for Priya's work holiday party. And I understood, in the particular way you understand things you'd rather not, that the sitter had not fallen through, so much as never been seriously arranged in the first place. There was the doctor's appointment the following spring, when my cardiologist recommended a stress test after some mild chest tightness I'd mentioned at a routine visit. I told Daniel about it over dinner, mentioned the date almost in passing, and watched him nod and say, "That's good, Mom, that's smart," and then watched 3 weeks pass without him once asking how it had gone. I had gone alone. Carol had offered to drive me, and I'd said yes, grateful, and neither of us mentioned afterward how strange it was that my own son, living 20 feet down the hallway, hadn't thought to ask. There was Marcus, sweet, gap-toothed Marcus, standing in the backyard on his phone with a friend from school, saying, without any real malice in his voice, the way children repeat things they've absorbed from the air around them, "Nah, my grandma's like the old lady who lives with us. She doesn't really do anything. She just, pays for stuff." I stood at the kitchen window with a dish towel in my hands and heard every word. And I told myself that children say careless things, and that it was not Marcus's fault that no one in that house had ever corrected the picture he'd been given. Small things. I want to be honest with you. For a long time, I told myself they were small things, and that I was an old woman becoming oversensitive in her solitude. I told my dear friend Carol, who has lived next door to me for 19 years, that I was probably imagining slights that weren't real. Carol, who has never once minced words with me in 2 decades of friendship, looked at me over her coffee one Tuesday morning in October and said, "Eleanor, you are the only person I know who can list 11 examples of being disrespected and then apologize for noticing." She wasn't wrong, but it took Thanksgiving morning to make me finally, truly see it. The trip to Dubai had been discussed for weeks. I knew that much. Priya's cousin was getting married there, a lavish destination wedding, and Daniel and Priya had decided, sometime in September, that they would take all 3 children and make a full week of it. The wedding, then several days of sightseeing, then a return flight the Monday after Thanksgiving. I had known about the trip. What I had not known, what no one had told me, not once, in any conversation over those weeks, was that they intended to fly out on Thanksgiving Day itself, leaving me alone in the house on the one holiday of the year that had always, without exception, belonged to family. I found out the way I found out most things by then, by accident. I saw the boarding passes printed and sitting on the kitchen counter the Wednesday evening before while I was putting away dishes. 5 tickets, 1 flight, departing at 6:40 the following morning from Dayton, connecting through JFK. I stood there holding a stack of dinner plates and felt something cold settle into my chest. I did not say anything that night. I went up to my bedroom and lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of suitcases being zipped downstairs, listening to the twins arguing over a window seat, listening to my son's voice, light and easy, telling his wife they should leave a note for me on the counter so I wouldn't worry. They did not leave a note. Instead, in the gray hour before dawn, I heard the front door close softly, heard the minivan pull out of the driveway, and then, an hour later, my phone buzzed once with a voicemail. Daniel's voice, rushed, apologetic in the thin way people are apologetic when they've already decided the apology is sufficient payment for the offense. "Mom, we already left for the airport. Didn't want to wake you. We'll call you from Dubai. Happy Thanksgiving." I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that morning. The turkey I had bought the week before, because some habits of preparation never fully die in me, even when no one had asked me to cook, sat in the refrigerator, thawing for a dinner that would now never happen. I looked at the empty chairs. I thought about the $62,000 in tuition. I thought about $11,000 in roofing. I thought about 3 years of a full refrigerator and a full house and a life I had quietly financed for people who could not be bothered to tell me they were leaving the country on the one day of the year I had always considered sacred. And then something in me, something that had been slowly gathering strength for 3 years without my fully realizing it, simply settled into place. I was not angry, not in the way anger burns hot and then fades. This was colder than that, and steadier. I picked up the phone, and instead of calling my son back, instead of leaving him a wounded voicemail he could listen to at his leisure between cocktails, I called Meridian Moving and Storage, a company I had used decades earlier when I closed my accounting office, and I asked how quickly they could send a crew. "For what kind of job, ma'am?" the woman on the phone asked. "For moving my own furniture out of my own house," I told her. "I'd like to start as soon as possible. Let me be clear about something, because I know how this might sound. I was not moving out. This was still my house, my name on the deed, my 30 years of savings that had bought it free and clear. What I intended to move was not my life, but theirs. Or rather, to begin the long, careful process of returning my house to being my house again and returning my life to being my own. That afternoon, alone in the quiet, I did something I had never once done in 3 years. I walked through my own home like an auditor walking through a client's books, looking not at furniture, but at facts. I went into what had become Daniel's home office, the small room off the garage that used to be Robert's workshop, and I began going through the filing cabinet where I kept my important papers. Not to snoop, but because I needed my deed, my will, my bank statements, documents I hadn't looked at closely in far too long. What I found there did more to steady my resolve than anything else could have. On top of the filing cabinet, in a shallow tray Daniel used for loose mail, I found a printed itinerary for the Dubai trip, 5 names, a wedding venue in Palm Jumeirah, and a total trip cost. Flights, hotel, a gift for the bride and groom of just under $11,000. Tucked beneath it was a bank confirmation email, printed and folded, showing a transfer of $9,000 from an account ending in the same 4 digits as my own primary checking account, dated the second week of November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. I stood in that small room holding both papers, and I thought about how, 3 weeks earlier, at dinner, Daniel had mentioned the trip cost was mostly covered, don't worry about it, and how I had not worried about it because I had trusted him. I also found, though I want to say I did not go looking for it and felt genuinely uneasy reading it, a text conversation left open on an old tablet Daniel sometimes used for the kids' shows between him and Priya from several weeks earlier. I have thought carefully about whether to repeat it here, and I've decided that honesty requires it because it changed something in me that afternoon. Priya had written, "Are we seriously not telling her we're leaving Thanksgiving morning? She's going to be so hurt." And Daniel had written back, "She'll be fine. She always is. If we tell her now, she'll want to make it a whole thing, cook a big dinner, get her feelings involved. Easier to just go." I read that exchange twice, standing in what used to be my husband's workshop, and something in my chest went very quiet and very still. I want to tell you about my friend Carol first, though, because without her steadiness that Thanksgiving afternoon, I don't know that I would have trusted my own judgment as completely as I came to. Carol Pruitt has lived in the yellow house next door since before Daniel graduated high school. She is 71, a retired hospice nurse, and she has buried a husband and outlived 2 dogs, and there is very little in this world that rattles her. When she saw the moving truck pull into my driveway that Thanksgiving afternoon, because of course she saw it, Carol sees everything. She came across the lawn in her housecoat and stood at my kitchen door with her arms crossed. "Eleanor Whitfield," she said, "tell me you have not lost your mind." I told her everything. The boarding passes, the voicemail, the empty chairs. 3 years of numbers I had never once added up out loud until that morning when I sat with a legal pad and simply wrote them down. 62,000 in tuition, 18,000 for the minivan, 11,000 for the roof, somewhere close to 30,000 more in groceries, utilities, and incidentals across 3 years, conservatively. Over $120,000 and not $1 of rent, not one moment of being asked whether any of it was convenient for me, and finally, not even a note on the kitchen counter on Thanksgiving morning. Carol was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she said the thing that I have carried with me since. "Eleanor, you have spent your whole life making sure everyone else's ledger balanced. Maybe it's time you looked at your own." She made the calls with me that afternoon. Not because I couldn't have done it alone, but because some decisions are steadier when spoken aloud to someone who loves you. It was Carol who reminded me that her late husband's nephew, Richard Hale, was a real estate and elder law attorney with an office not 20 minutes away, and that his firm sometimes took emergency consultations, even on holidays, for exactly the kind of situation I now found myself in. It was Carol who sat beside me at my kitchen table while I called his office line, and it was Carol who drove me there the following morning, the Friday after Thanksgiving, while my son's family was somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. Richard Hale was younger than I expected. Maybe 45, with the calm, unhurried manner of a man who has seen every version of family conflict a house deed can produce. I laid out my documents on his desk. The deed to the Maple Street house, solely in my name, purchased in full 11 years earlier. My will, last updated 6 years prior, before the twins were even born, which left the house and the bulk of my estate to Daniel outright. My bank statements, showing the tuition payments, the minivan purchase, the roofing invoice, all made from my personal accounts. "The house is entirely yours," Richard confirmed, looking up from the deed. "There's no mortgage, no cosigner, no transfer of any kind to your son or his wife. Legally, they are residents in your home with your permission and nothing more. You could, if you chose, ask them to leave with appropriate notice under Ohio law, precisely as you would any other occupant. I don't want to throw my grandchildren into the street," I told him. "No one is suggesting that," Richard said gently. "But you do have options, and I think it's important you understand all of them before your son comes home." We spent nearly 2 hours in that office. I learned that under Ohio law, because there was no formal lease and no rent had ever been paid, Daniel and his family were considered, at best, licensees in my home. Guests, essentially, with no tenant protections at all. I could give them a reasonable notice to vacate, and if they refused to leave, I could pursue a legal process to have them removed, though Richard and I both hoped it would never come to that. I learned that my will, unchanged for 6 years, would currently leave everything to Daniel outright, with no protections at all for my grandchildren's futures, and no acknowledgement of the money I had already given. And I learned something else, something that Richard raised carefully, watching my face as he said it. Richard leaned back in his chair for a moment before he spoke again, the way careful people do when they are about to say something that will matter more than they'd like it to. I want to walk you through your options slowly, Mrs. Whitfield, because I find that people in your position often move too fast in one direction or the other. Either they do nothing at all, out of guilt, or they try to burn the whole house down, so to speak, out of hurt. Neither one usually serves you well a year from now. I don't intend to burn anything down, I told him. I intend to be very precise. Good, he said, and I could hear something like respect settle into his voice. Precision is what protects you here. Let's start with the deed, since that's the simplest question. Has your son's name ever appeared on it, at any point, for any reason? Refinancing, a home equity line, anything at all? Never, I said. I paid cash in 2015. There has never been another name on that deed. Then legally, whatever else is true, this remains entirely your house, and your son and his family are residents with your permission and nothing more, Richard said. That's your foundation. Everything else we build sits on top of that fact. He made a note, then looked up at me with the particular carefulness of a man about to ask something he suspected would land hard. Mrs. Whitfield, I want to ask you something, and please don't take it the wrong way. Has your son or anyone in his household ever had access to your financial accounts? Power of attorney, authorized user status, anything of that kind? I told him yes. 2 years earlier, when I'd had a minor health scare. A fall on the icy porch steps that put me in the emergency room overnight. Nothing serious in the end. A mild concussion and a bruised hip, but frightening at the time. Daniel had sat by my hospital bed and held my hand and told me, with real fear in his voice, that he couldn't stand the thought of something happening to me and no one being able to act quickly. Just in case, Mom, he'd said. Just so if you're ever in a bed like this again and can't get to the bank yourself, I can pay the electric bill. I can make sure things don't fall apart. I remember how moved I was by that, how I thought, lying in that hospital bed at 66 years old, that I had raised a son who worried about me the way I had always worried about him. I had agreed without a second thought. I had gone with him to the bank myself the following week and signed the paperwork adding him as an authorized user, and I had felt, driving home that day, something like relief. The relief of believing you are no longer entirely alone in the world, that someone is watching for you the way you have always watched for everyone else. I think of that afternoon often now, and I don't regret the impulse behind it, even knowing what I know. I regret only that I never once, in 2 years, thought to look closely at what that access had quietly become. I'd like you to pull your statements from the past 6 months before we finish today, Richard said, just so you have full clarity. I want to tell you honestly that I did not expect what we found. I had assumed, foolishly perhaps, that an authorized user designation meant only that Daniel could act on my behalf in an emergency, not that he had been quietly using it at all. But sitting in Richard's office that Friday afternoon, going line by line through 6 months of statements on his office computer, I found 3 withdrawals I had never made and never authorized. $4,000 in July, described only as an ATM withdrawal at a branch I had never once visited. $6,000 in September, transferred to an account I didn't recognize. And 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, a withdrawal of $9,000, taken the same week. I would later learn that the Dubai trip had been booked in full. I sat very still in that office chair. Richard, to his credit, did not fill the silence with reassurance. He let me sit with it. $19,000, I said finally, more to myself than to him. Without asking me. Without asking you, Richard confirmed quietly. I did not cry in that office, though I wanted to tell you honestly that some part of me wanted to. I have found, across 68 years, that crying is sometimes a release and sometimes a delay, and I did not have time that day for delay. What I felt instead was a kind of clarifying stillness, the same stillness I had felt standing in my empty kitchen the morning before. Whatever guilt I might have carried about asking my son's family to leave my home evaporated in that chair. This was no longer about a missed Thanksgiving. This was about a pattern, 3 years deep, of a woman being quietly, systematically treated as a resource rather than a mother. We spent the rest of that Friday afternoon putting a plan in motion, and I want to walk you through it exactly as it happened, because I think the details matter. The first thing we did was close the authorized user access on my checking account entirely and open 2 new accounts at a different bank altogether, in my name only, transferring the bulk of my savings into them before end of business that day. Richard's paralegal helped me do this from the office, and by 4 o'clock that Friday afternoon, Daniel's name no longer appeared on a single one of my financial accounts. The second thing we did was draft a formal, written notice, not yet delivered, but prepared and ready, informing Daniel and Priya that, effective 60 days from the date of delivery, they and their household would need to vacate the property at 1442 Maple Street. 60 days was more generous than the law required, but I wanted no one, least of all my grandchildren, to say I had acted cruelly. I wanted to act clearly and firmly and fairly all at once. The third thing we did was update my will. This was, in some ways, the hardest conversation of the afternoon because it meant confronting, on paper, what I actually believed my son had become capable of. Richard drew up a new will that afternoon, to be formalized the following week with proper witnesses, but drafted in full that day. That placed the house and the majority of my estate into a trust for my 3 grandchildren, to be administered by Carol as trustee until each child turned 25, with specific carve-outs to ensure their education and well-being were protected regardless of what happened between their parents and me. Daniel would still inherit something. I could not, in the end, cut my only son out entirely, whatever he had done. But it would be a modest sum, a fraction of what he might once have expected, and nothing at all resembling the house he had perhaps assumed, in some unspoken way, would simply become his one day. I want to pause here and tell you something important, something I said to Carol on the drive home from Richard's office that evening. I was not doing any of this out of vengeance. I want you to understand that clearly. I have never in my life wanted to destroy my son. What I wanted, finally, after 3 years of quiet erosion, was simply to be seen, to matter as more than a checkbook, to be considered in decisions about my own household, to be remembered, even once, on the one holiday that had always been sacred to our family. If Daniel had called me from that airport gate, even at 5 in the morning, even in a rush, and said, "Mom, I'm sorry. We should have told you sooner. We love you. We'll call from Dubai." If there had been even that much warmth in the goodbye, I don't know that any of this would have happened, but there had been no warmth. There had been a voicemail, brisk and already halfway forgotten, sent to a woman standing alone in an empty house on Thanksgiving morning. The moving crew came that Friday and worked through Saturday. I want to be precise about what I had them move, because I know some people, hearing "I called the movers," imagine me emptying the entire house down to the studs out of spite. That is not what happened. I had them move only what was mine and only what mattered. My mother's china, packed away in the basement for years and never once used at any holiday meal in that house since Priya took over the hosting. Robert's old roll-top desk, which Daniel had at some point moved into the garage to make room for a treadmill. 3 boxes of family photo albums that I found, to my quiet heartbreak, stacked in a closet gathering dust. My grandmother's quilts. The dining set Robert and I had bought in 1987, which Priya had replaced 2 years earlier with a newer table, more suited to the kids, while mine sat disassembled in the basement. I had all of it moved into a climate-controlled storage unit across town, and I moved myself, for those 5 days, into a guest room at Carol's house next door, so that when Daniel's family returned, the house would still stand, still be livable, still have furniture in every room. Just not the pieces that had been quietly relegated to storage while I still lived among them, unseen. I stood in the doorway of my old bedroom on Saturday evening, watching 2 young men in matching gray shirts carry Robert's roll-top desk down the stairs with the careful, practiced ease of people who move furniture for a living and feel none of the weight the furniture actually carries. I did not cry then either, though I came close, watching that desk. The one Robert had refinished himself the winter before he died, sanding it by hand in the garage while I brought him coffee and complained about the sawdust tracked into the kitchen, disappear into the back of a truck. Carol stood beside me with her hand on my shoulder and said nothing at all, which was, I think, exactly the right thing to say. By Sunday, everything was in order. Richard had the notice to vacate, drawn up and ready, though we agreed I would deliver it in person, not by mail, because whatever else was true, I did not want my son to receive the most important document of his adult life through a stranger's hands. The new will was drafted, awaiting formal signing that Tuesday. My accounts were secured. And I sat in Carol's guest room on Sunday night, 5 days into this strange, still, clarifying silence, and looked at my phone. 25 missed calls. That is not an exaggeration for the sake of the story. I counted them precisely, because counting precisely is simply who I am. Daniel had called 11 times. Priya had called 9 times, which surprised me, since Priya rarely called me for anything at all. Sophia, my 16-year-old granddaughter, had called twice and left one voicemail that I listened to 3 times because her voice on it was shaking. "Grandma, where's the china? Where's Grandpa's desk? Mom's really upset. Please call us back." I called them back that evening, not because of the panic in the calls, but because I had never intended to disappear or to punish them through silence. I intended to be direct, and directness requires presence, not distance. Daniel picked up before the first ring finished. Mom, thank God. Where have you been?" We got home and the house is. Half the furniture is gone and your bedroom is completely empty. And I thought, we thought something happened to you. "Nothing happened to me, Daniel," I said. "I'm fine. I'm at Carol's. What is going on? Why would you do this? We were gone 5 days." I remember exactly what I said next, because I had thought about this moment for 4 of those 5 days, turning the words over until they were smooth and true. "You flew to Dubai on Thanksgiving morning and left me a voicemail instead of a goodbye. And when I looked closely at everything else, Daniel, I found $19,000 taken from my account this year that I never authorized. So I think it's time we talk, all of us, in person, tomorrow. Not on the phone." There was a long silence on the line. I could hear Priya's voice in the background, sharp and frightened, asking what I'd said. And then Daniel said, quietly, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager caught in a lie, "Mom, I can explain the money." "I'm sure you can," I told him. "Tomorrow." 2 o'clock. I'll come to the house. I want to tell you about that meeting now, because it was, in every sense, the center of everything. The moment the performance of the previous 5 days finally ended, and the truth, all of it, came out into the light of my own dining room. I arrived at 2 o'clock exactly, with Richard's sealed notice in my handbag and Carol driving me, though she waited in the car at my request. I wanted to face this myself. The house looked strange to me already, emptied in places I had grown so used to seeing full. Daniel opened the door looking as though he hadn't slept on the flight home, and Priya stood behind him in the front hallway, arms crossed, her face doing that particular thing faces do when a person is deciding, in real time, whether to attack or to weep. We sat in the living room, the one piece of furniture I hadn't moved, my old blue armchair, empty in the corner because none of them had ever wanted to sit in it. The children were upstairs. I had asked, gently but firmly, that this first conversation happen without them. "Tell me about the money," I said, before either of them could start with an accusation of their own. Daniel's face went through several expressions before settling into something like defeat. "It wasn't. Mom, it wasn't stealing. I want you to understand that. When you had that fall, and the doctor said we needed to be ready for anything, I started thinking about what happens if something happens to you, and there's no cushion, and we're stuck." The business account was overdrawn twice this year. I took what I took because I was scared, and I told myself I'd put it back before you noticed. "You took $19,000 from your mother to fund a vacation to Dubai," I said. My voice did not rise. I had promised myself, in Richard's office, that it would not rise. "You did not put anything back. And you left me alone on Thanksgiving morning with a voicemail instead of a conversation." It was Priya who broke first, and I want to tell you honestly that I did not expect it to be her. She had always been the sharper of the two, the one who managed the household with an efficiency that sometimes felt like cold calculation, and I had braced myself for her to defend the trip, to minimize the money, to tell me I was overreacting to a holiday. Instead, she put her hands over her face and said, muffled, This is exactly what my mother said would happen. She told me 2 years ago that we were taking too much from you and giving nothing back. And I told her we'd figure it out eventually, and we never did. And now look at us." Daniel looked at his wife with something between betrayal and recognition. "You knew about the money?" "I knew you were stressed about the business account," Priya said. "I didn't know you were pulling from your mother's checking account to cover it. Daniel, that's not the same thing." I let that sit in the room for a moment because I had learned, across 3 years of quiet observation, that silence reveals more than questions sometimes do. And in that silence, Daniel finally said the thing I think he had needed to say for longer than even he realized. "I think I convinced myself it was fine because you never asked us for anything," he said, looking at me directly for what felt like the first time in months. "You never asked for rent. You never asked us to pay you back for anything. You just kept giving and giving, and I think somewhere along the way I stopped seeing it as generosity and started seeing it as just how things were, like the roof or the electricity. Just there." I told him then what I had come to say, plainly, the way I would have delivered a difficult figure to a client decades earlier, with clarity and without cruelty, but without softening the truth either. "I want you to understand something, Daniel. I have never once regretted helping you and Priya and those children. $62,000 in school tuition, $11,000 for the roof, groceries, gifts, a car, 3 years of a full refrigerator. I would do almost all of it again, gladly, because that is what a mother does for her family. But somewhere in these 3 years, you all stopped treating me like family and started treating me like infrastructure. Something reliable, something that pays the bills and keeps the lights on and doesn't need to be told anything, because it will simply always be there. And on Thanksgiving morning, when you left this house without so much as a note on the counter, I understood, finally, exactly how invisible I had become in my own home. Priya was crying by then, quietly, and I want to be fair to her. I believe her tears were real, not performed. But I had learned enough, in 68 years, to know that real tears and real change are not always the same thing, and I was not there to be comforted. I was there to tell them what came next. I told them about the notice, sealed in my handbag, giving them 60 days to make arrangements. Far more time than the law required, and more, I said honestly, than some part of me had wanted to give them in my angriest moment. But I had decided that punishing my grandchildren for their parents' choices was not the kind of woman I wanted to be. I told them the house would remain in my name, and that I had restructured my will so that whatever came to my grandchildren eventually would come to them directly, protected, regardless of what happened between the adults in that room. I told them my accounts were secured and that Daniel's name would no longer appear on any of them. Daniel did not shout, and I want to acknowledge that because I think it would have been easier, in some ways, if he had. Anger is simpler to sit across from than the low, defeated quiet that actually settled over him. "So that's it," he said. "You're kicking us out. I'm asking you to build a life that doesn't depend on me disappearing into it," I said. "You have 60 days, and I will help you find a rental if you need it, and I will still be your mother, and I will still love those children upstairs more than anything in this world. But I will not be invisible in my own house anymore, Daniel. I spent 3 years being useful and unseen at the same time, and I am 68 years old, and I have decided I would rather be seen." Priya, still crying, asked the question I think she had actually wanted to ask from the moment I walked in. "Are you going to tell the kids why we're leaving?" "I'm going to tell them the truth, gently, in whatever way is age appropriate," I said. "I am not going to pretend to them that Grandma simply decided she wanted her house back for no reason. But I am also not going to turn them against their parents. That is not the kind of grandmother I intend to be, whatever else has happened." Daniel put his head in his hands then, and when he looked up, his eyes were red. "I found the itinerary, didn't I? And the text. You saw the text." "I did," I said. There was no point pretending otherwise, and I have never believed that pretending helps anyone heal faster. "She'll be fine. She always is. That's what you wrote to your wife." He flinched at hearing his own words repeated back to him, and I watched something in his face crumble that I had not seen crumble since he was a boy caught taking money from my purse for candy decades ago and had cried not because he was in trouble, but because he understood all at once that I had trusted him and he had broken that trust on purpose. "I didn't mean it the way it sounds," he said. "I meant. I've always thought of you as someone who could handle anything. I didn't think of it as unkind. I think I told myself that made it okay. Being able to handle things isn't the same as not needing anyone to notice you," I said. "I have handled a great deal in my life, Daniel. That never once meant I stopped needing to matter to the people I handled it for." Priya wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, quietly, "Sophia asked me on the plane home why Grandma wasn't coming to Dubai with us. I told her Grandma doesn't like to fly long distances. She looked at me and said, 'That's not true. Grandma flew to Florida for Aunt Carol's sister's funeral last year. She's 16, Eleanor. She saw it before either of us were willing to.' That detail, more than almost anything else said in that room, stayed with me afterward. The idea that my granddaughter, only 16, had noticed what her own parents had trained themselves not to see. I want to tell you now about the differentiation this experience revealed between my son and my daughter-in-law, because I think it matters, and because it is not as simple as villain and victim. In the weeks that followed, Priya was the one who called me most often, not to argue, but slowly, tentatively, to rebuild something. She asked, 3 weeks in, if she could come over without the children and simply talk, and we sat at Carol's kitchen table because I still had not returned fully to Maple Street by then, and she told me things I had not fully understood, that she had felt, for 2 of those 3 years, trapped in a marriage where financial anxiety had quietly poisoned nearly every decision, that she had raised concerns about taking too much from me more than once and been waved off, that some part of her relief about the Dubai trip had been about escaping, for 1 week, a house that had started to feel suffocating to all of them, myself very much, included, though none of us had said so aloud. Daniel, for his part, broke differently. He did not call as often. When he did call, in the first 2 weeks, it was mostly to relitigate the fairness of the notice, to ask whether 60 days was really enough time, to ask, once, in a moment of raw and unguarded hurt, whether I had ever really forgiven him for anything in his life, or whether I simply kept a ledger of every mistake he'd made since childhood. That question stung, I'll admit, because it touched something true and something unfair all at once. I had, in fact, forgiven him for a great deal across the years, but I had also, apparently, kept a more careful account than I realized of what forgiveness had cost me. Priya's parents called me directly, about 10 days after the confrontation, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that month. Her mother, Mina, a warm, no-nonsense woman I had always liked from our few visits together, said, "Eleanor, I want you to know I told Priya years ago this arrangement wasn't fair to you, and I want you to know that whatever she or Daniel say to you, you did nothing wrong here. A mother is not a bank account." I told her I appreciated that more than she knew, and I meant it. There is a particular relief in being told by someone outside your own household that your instincts were sound all along, especially after 3 years of quietly wondering whether you were the unreasonable one. Mina told me, too, that she had specifically asked Priya, before the Dubai trip was booked, whether Eleanor was coming, and that Priya had changed the subject rather than answer directly. She knew, Mina said simply. She knew it wasn't right, and she let it happen anyway, because it was easier than the conversation. There was a scene during that first week, one I haven't mentioned yet, that I think belongs here. When I went to the new bank to open my accounts, the young officer who helped me, a woman named Denise, no older than 30, asked, in the mild, procedural way bank officers ask such things, whether I wanted a secondary contact listed on the account for emergencies. I told her no, not right now, and she nodded and moved on without comment. But I sat in that plastic chair afterward and felt the full, strange weight of that small refusal. For 2 years, I had believed that being watched over was a form of safety. Sitting in that bank, I understood for the first time that it can just as easily become a form of exposure if you never check what the watching has turned into. Sophia called me on the Tuesday after the confrontation at the house, without her parents' knowledge, from her own phone, and asked if she could come sit with me at Carol's for a while after school. I said yes, of course, and when she arrived, she sat on the porch steps in her coat, not quite looking at me, and said, "I heard Mom and Dad fighting about money last night. Is this because of the trip?" I told her, as gently and honestly as I knew how, that some of it was about the trip, and some of it was about things that had been building for a long time before the trip, and that none of it was in any way her fault or her brother's fault. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I knew the tuition was expensive. Mom mentioned it once, like in passing, that Grandma pays for it." I never really thought about what that meant until now. I told her that was all right, that 16-year-olds are not meant to audit their parents' finances, and that my only hope was that she would grow up understanding money as something you handle honestly, with the people you love, rather than something you simply hope no one looks at too closely. She hugged me before she left, tightly, the way she used to hug me when she was small, and said, "I'm glad you took your grandma's china back, by the way. I always liked that pattern better than Mom's new table anyway." It took nearly a month before Daniel came to see me alone, without Priya, without an agenda beyond simply sitting across from his mother and being honest. He came to Carol's porch on a cold Saturday afternoon in December, and he sat down across from me, and he said, "I've been so angry at you for 3 weeks, and I finally figured out today that I'm not angry at you at all. I'm angry at myself, and it's easier to be angry at you." "That's usually how it works," I told him. "I don't know how to fix what I did," he said. "The money, I mean. I can pay it back eventually. But the Thanksgiving thing. I don't know how you fix leaving your own mother alone on a holiday with a voicemail." "You don't fix it," I said. "You simply don't do it again. And you tell me, honestly, the next time you're scared or overwhelmed or ashamed of where your finances are, instead of quietly deciding that my accounts are a safety net you don't have to mention. That's the fix, Daniel. Not an apology. A different way of being my son." He found a rental within 5 weeks, a smaller house across town, closer to the children's new schools. Because they left the private academy, an adjustment none of us pretended was easy, though Sophia, to her credit, took it with more grace than her parents did. I did continue paying for one thing after all of this settled. I set up a modest, formal education fund for all 3 grandchildren, administered through Richard's office and Carol as trustee, separate entirely from anything Daniel or Priya could access directly. It was less than I had spent before, and given far more deliberately, with far more protection, and I want to tell you that giving it that way, with structure and boundaries around it, felt entirely different from the quiet, boundless giving of the years before. It felt like love with a spine in it. The following Tuesday, I went back to Richard's office to formally sign the new will, with 2 witnesses from his firm and a notary present, the way such things are properly done. I remember sitting at that conference table, pen in hand, and feeling none of the coldness I might have expected from an act that essentially disinherited my only son of the house he might once have assumed was his. What I felt instead was something closer to relief. The particular relief of finally putting on paper what I actually believed, rather than what habit and hope had kept on paper for 6 years past its truth. Richard walked me through each provision slowly. The trust for the 3 grandchildren, administered by Carol until each turned 25, protected from creditors and from any future financial trouble their parents might face. The modest but real inheritance still set aside for Daniel, enough to matter, not enough to ever again be mistaken for a safety net he didn't have to think about. A small bequest to Carol herself, which she tried, predictably, to refuse, and which I insisted on regardless, because 30 years of friendship and one extraordinary week of driving me to a lawyer's office on a holiday weekend deserved to be remembered in something more permanent than gratitude alone. I moved back into the Maple Street house in January, once Daniel's family had settled into their new place, and Carol helped me bring my mother's china and Robert's roll-top desk and the old family photo albums back out of storage and into rooms that were, for the first time in 3 years, entirely and simply mine. I hosted Thanksgiving again the following year. Daniel and Priya and all 3 grandchildren at my table, with my dining set, cooked by my own 2 hands. And I want to tell you that when Daniel stood in my kitchen that morning, helping me lift the turkey from the oven, he said something I have carried with me since. "I used to think love meant you'd always be there no matter what we did," he said. "I think I understand now that love and being taken for granted aren't the same thing, even when they look alike from the inside. I think that is the truest thing my son has ever said to me." If you have made it this far in my story, I suspect some part of it touched something familiar in you. The particular loneliness of being useful without being seen, of giving so steadily and so long that the people you love forget it is a gift and not simply a feature of the household, like electricity or running water. I want to tell you, gently, that noticing this in your own life is not bitterness, and it is not selfishness, whatever anyone tells you. It is simply clarity arriving later than you might have wished, and clarity, even late, is always worth acting on. So many of us are taught, especially women of my generation, that love which keeps a ledger is somehow lesser than love which gives without limit. I no longer believe that. I believe now that love without any ledger at all simply teaches the people around you that your limits do not exist, and eventually, without meaning to, they will find the very edges of you and walk straight past them, because you never once showed them where those edges were. I learned something in those 5 days that I think is worth more than the $62,000 in tuition or the $19,000 that vanished from my account without my knowledge. I learned that generosity without boundaries does not teach the people you love to appreciate you. It teaches them, slowly and without any cruel intention on anyone's part, that you do not require appreciation at all. And I learned that reclaiming your own dignity does not require rage or revenge or even raised voices. It requires only clarity, patience, and the quiet, steady willingness to finally add up the numbers you have spent years pretending not to notice. I think often, in the quiet of that house now, about my husband Robert, and about the garden he wanted and never got to plant. I planted it myself the spring after all of this settled, tomatoes and marigolds along the border, and a small patch of the zinnias my mother used to grow behind our house in Dayton when I was a girl. I did it alone on a Saturday morning, with dirt under my fingernails and no one watching. And I remember thinking, kneeling there in the new soil, that this was perhaps the truest measure of everything that had changed. Not the money recovered, not the will rewritten, not even the apology Daniel eventually gave me in full, sitting at my kitchen table on a Sunday in February, crying in a way I had not seen him cry since he was a small boy. The truest measure was simply this, that I could kneel alone in my own garden, in my own yard, at 68 years old, and feel entirely at peace rather than entirely forgotten. Those are not the same feeling, though for 3 years I had mistaken one for the other. I want to say something too about forgiveness, because I know some of you listening have already decided, somewhere in this story, whether you think I forgave my son too easily or not easily enough, and I want to tell you that both instincts are usually a little bit right and a little bit wrong. I did forgive Daniel. I forgave him because he is my son, because he came to my porch on a cold December afternoon and told me the truth without being cornered into it, because he has, in the 2 years since, paid back every dollar he took from that account in slow, deliberate installments he insisted on making even when I told him it wasn't necessary. But forgiveness, I have come to understand, is not the same thing as forgetting, and it is certainly not the same thing as returning to exactly how things were before. I forgave my son, and I still, to this day, keep my own accounts, my own keys, my own name alone on the deed to my own house. Forgiveness restored our relationship. It did not restore his access to my life in the shape it once had. I think that distinction, more than any other single thing I could tell you, is the heart of what I want you to take from this story. To the woman listening tonight who recognizes herself in me, who has quietly paid for tuition, or groceries, or a roof, or a car, and told herself it was simply what mothers do, who has noticed the small silences in a room she used to fill, who has been called, even affectionately, the old lady, and felt something crack quietly inside her chest when she heard it. I want you to know that noticing is not the end of love. It is very often the beginning of a truer version of it. You are allowed to add up the numbers. You are allowed to ask to be told the truth about a flight, a trip, a decision made about the house you built. You are allowed, at 65, at 70, at 75, to still expect a goodbye. I am 68 years old, and I intend to spend whatever years remain to me being generous still, because that is who I have always been and who I still choose to be. But I intend to be generous as a woman who is seen in a house that is undeniably, entirely her own, at a table where no one leaves without a proper goodbye ever again. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? I read every message, and you mean more to me than you know. For more stories like this one, like this video, and subscribe. There is so much more waiting for you, with love and respect. Until next time.